This engraving shows the Congress of Vienna, where monarchs and statesmen gathered in late 1814 to draw new borders. Confident the threat that dominated their lives was neutralized, they began bickering over new territories, assuming the past was entirely behind them. But the man responsible for that decade of war was watching from the tiny Mediterranean island of Elba. At 45 years old, comprehensively defeated and stripped of his empire, Napoleon Bonaparte had been handed this isolated rocky port town to rule in exile. He refused to stay there. In February 1815, a small flotilla slipped quietly out of his Mediterranean exile. Aboard was the former emperor, possessing no wealth and commanding a skeleton crew of barely 1,000 men. To avoid heavily guarded royalist towns, Napoleon took his meager force through a punishing eastern mountain route. It was a brutal physical ordeal. The aging commander had to traverse sheer, icy cliff tracks on foot, marching 190 miles in just 6 days, and repeatedly needing assistance in the snow. He landed in France with practically nothing. He lacked the funds to raise a proper army or the artillery to fight a pitched battle. To overthrow the established Bourbon monarchy, his only conceivable weapon was absolute speed. To survive, he had to intercept and convert the French military to his side before the king could organize a trap to arrest or kill him. On March 7th, his path was finally blocked outside Grenoble by the French 5th Line Infantry Regiment. Stepping into the open with zero cover against a wall of loaded muskets was a fatal risk. Instead of ordering his men to fight, Napoleon stepped ahead of his ranks. He threw open his gray coat and dared any man in the regiment who wished to kill his emperor to pull the trigger. A royalist captain ordered the men to fire, but the line remained silent. Seconds later, cries of "Vive l'Empereur" broke out. The 5th Regiment defected on the spot, triggering a massive chain reaction across the French armed forces. Even Marshal Ney, his former commander who had promised the king he would bring Napoleon back in an iron cage, found his own troops grumbling. Facing mutiny and a welcoming letter from his old master, Ney abandoned his pledge and brought 3,000 men to the emperor's side. Napoleon bypassed standard military logistics entirely. By weaponizing his own charisma and the loyalty of his veterans, he hijacked the momentum of an entire nation. He generated a massive army out of thin air in a matter of days. This engraving captures the Tuileries Palace in Paris. By March 20th, King Louis XVIII fled, and Napoleon reclaimed the throne without firing a shot. He was back in control of a nation, with tens of thousands of veterans flocking to his newly reformed Imperial Guard. But the moment the monarchs in Vienna heard of his landing, their bitter disputes vanished. They immediately suspended their arguments over territory to form a 7th coalition. In an extraordinary legal maneuver, this alliance did not declare war on the nation of France. They declared war specifically on Napoleon Bonaparte, labeling him an outlaw and an enemy of world peace. The coalition planned to raise 4 massive armies simultaneously, supported by smaller contingents across Europe. On paper, they were mobilizing nearly 1 million men against Napoleon's exhausted and poorly funded force of barely 200,000. Time had become his greatest enemy. Waiting on the defensive guaranteed he would be crushed by the sheer weight of international numbers. His only path to survival was a preemptive strike north into Belgium before the coalition could assemble. Napoleon plotted a lightning offensive aimed at the forces closest to the French border, the armies of the Duke of Wellington and Prussian Field Marshal Blücher. But the command structure he relied on to execute this complex maneuver was fractured. Crucially, he was missing Marshal Berthier, his indispensable chief of staff for the past 2 decades, who had fled to the Netherlands. Berthier had mastered the vital role of overseeing headquarters and translating the emperor's rapid-fire thoughts into clear, precise battlefield orders. Without him, the flow of communication severely deteriorated. Napoleon placed Marshal Soult, an excellent battlefield commander, into Berthier's administrative role. Soult struggled in the new position, immediately bungling the initial orders and mistakenly concentrating the entire army west of where Napoleon intended. The physical toll was also catching up with the emperor. While he was still capable of working 15-hour days, his finance minister observed that Napoleon's meditations were becoming labored, and a deep fatigue settled over him that he had never shown in his younger years. To the crowds in Paris, the myth of the invincible emperor was perfectly intact, but behind the scenes, the invisible machinery of his army, the exact logistics required to move mass amounts of men seamlessly, was failing. To catch Wellington and Blücher off guard, the French imposed strict secrecy along the Belgian border. Civilians were barred from crossing, and troop movements were hidden behind deliberate misinformation. But the plan began to unravel. A cavalry corps fell behind, an infantry corps was delayed, and a division commander defected, taking critical intelligence straight to the enemy. Napoleon had chosen the 14th of June, the anniversary of two of his greatest past victories, to launch the invasion, but the sheer disorganization forced him to delay the start by a full 24 hours, bleeding away the critical advantage of time. Finally, at 2 a.m. on June 15th, the drums beat the call to arms. The first French battalions crossed the frontier into Belgium, but Prussian sentries were already racing away to inform Wellington and Blücher. The element of surprise was gone. Napoleon's personal magnetism was enough to conquer France without firing a shot. But he could not outrun the relentless math of military logistics. His final march north was a doomed race against an organizing world.